to The Plain Truth, a show where we go into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Joaquin Flores, who's a geopolitical analyst. Really needs no introduction. Joaquin, are you there?
Hey, how's it going, Paul?
Oh, hey. Just enjoying watching the ride. Is that a sunset or did something get detonated?
Or a mushroom cloud, right?
Something like that. How about you? How's life in Serbia? I hear a few stray things are happening there.
Yeah, it's all coming together as
good,
planned.
Right? All good.
It's all good in the hood, as they say. It's all coming together where we thought it would, and it's getting crazier and crazier. So I guess that's how it goes.
Well, talking to you earlier, offline, I noticed that you. How to put this nicely? Speaking of detonations, you kind of had a concern that we may be heading into a period of true conflict, not controlled artificial conflict, but a real conflict. Do you want to go into that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's you. Of course, you have people right on the internet since the internet started that are saying that the world's going to end tomorrow. And so there are a lot of popular alternative news sites that are a bit oversensitive on that. And I think that they get into sort of a Chicken Little, the sky is falling kind of routine. And that really can, really prohibit our ability to explain when a real situation is on the rise. And I think people like yourself and myself have been really conservative and are very level-headed in their approach to looking at world events. I mean, sometimes things look crazier than they are, then they kind of mellow out. And so with that said, we are in a situation where certainly things could really, really pop off in a very serious way. And that's not a conspirological thing, and it's not necessarily like a new world order thing, or it's we're talking about real, quantifiable, qualifiable things that we can point to everywhere in the world that is connected to a single global conflict, which is not cooling off, it's heating up.
Yeah, well, in a sense, I mean, most of us are, I don't know if you want to say desensitized to, we've been hearing about the end of the world for 40 years now or so.
Right.
There's always, global warming, global cooling, an asteroid, planet, you know what I mean? There's always something. Right. And to add to the mix, then, war, Cold War, nuclear war, that kind of thing. But it does have this feeling to me of like I want to research World War I more.
Yes.
I don't know if you get that feeling being in the Balkans,
yes.
But
I get that feeling in the Balkans, yes.
Isn't there a saying that about World War I? It was the war nobody wanted. The war was inevitable.
Right, and it was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And very interesting is that for example, just yesterday, Serbia and Croatia have at least for the time being ceased trade. So that's pretty significant for people who know about Yugoslavia in the 90s and EU integration. I mean, for Croatia and Serbia to close borders on each other is very, 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 very major. And economic blockades always of this type of scale, not just between Serbia and Croatia, but of this scale, say between Russia and the U.S. or between Russia and Europe. They typically come right before a major war.
So this might be a good time to ask then whether this is all part of a strategy, basically trying to blow up everything around the borders of Russia. What do you think?
It's not right. It's certainly that is part of the strategy, and not just around Russia, but also in the European Union. There is absolutely a plan underway. I'm not saying it's going to be successful. I'm not saying that it's not going to have resistance to it, but there is a push to collapse the social and economic foundations of the EU to push them into a situation where one of their only ways out will be a path of war, and to make that path of war in the Middle East, but even preferably on Russia. And those who want to make that war are under no illusion that Europe can win, or could win without it being a hollow victory, or a victory made at such a great cost that it would be like a reset of European development that was like what was witnessed following both world wars.
Yeah, it certainly looks like things are coming to a head. And well, okay, so we've got the Russian angle, but what about this whole Middle East? Do you think Turkey's about to be blown up? What do you think is going to happen with Syria? I mean, it just looks like, in addition to Eastern Europe, there's also the Middle East or the Near East.
Right, and when we look at a map, we can actually see how these theaters are connected. The Turkey has significant influence in the Middle East. It's a regional hegemon. It has political and economic ties all throughout the Balkans. It was, only 100 years ago, it was the Ottoman Empire, and 150 years before that, it still had much of its influence in the West Balkans even. And there was a time basically when Turkey bordered Italy, right? It was separated just by the little Adriatic there. So there is so much potential for Turkey to implode. There are absolutely forces from Turkey's own supposed allies that would like to do it similar to Europe. They want to push it to the brink of having to be forced to act, to make it the situation so politically unstable, socially and economically unstable, that it then must push to swallow up neighbors, or to create a war that will solve the problem of unspent, stored up arms and surplus populations and so forth. Well, so who do you think is pushing for war, if you could put a few words in on that? That is where it's difficult to say. One doesn't always want to name the devil. It's certainly, there's so much going on, and I think that people of conscience have to look deep into their hearts, and these are very difficult questions. It's been for a long time that we've talked about the multinational corporation, or the end of the nation states and globalization. People who were reading, geopolitics and international relations journals in the 80s and 90s, these were already household words in those fields. And so, one isn't talking about a particular country or a particular government, but interest groups that, I guess you could call them like modern day nomads. I mean, they don't really have a country of origin in the modern sense, and they don't really have a country that they have any particular allegiance to. And you might almost say they're kind of like a parasite that goes from host to host. And so you could say they're like a multinational cabal. But by multinational, I don't mean that they necessarily come from every country, but rather that they will go to every country. So but clearly, it is questionable if they have a particular, what their particular end game is. I mean, they certainly, we would imagine they have one, Paul. But is it really about the money? Or is it the power? Is there a more religious or esoteric angle involved? Or is there more about the human spirit or human nature, or the essence of human being that we don't know about, or that we're only barely starting to learn? I mean, when you get into these epics of mass war, there is a limited application to the economic benefit or even the power balance benefit, and then moreover, if it is as it is largely managed by a nationless power elite group, then what is their angle? Why wouldn't they just move from one country to another? Why would they necessarily have to pit one against the other to maintain power? And so that raises questions that are really outside of my area of study. And I think that analysts and people of integrity, have to know what is outside of their area of expertise, and firm, what their background is. And so it would seem really, quite frankly, that if a geopolitical analyst or someone from that area were to declare with absolute certainty that they knew what was happening and what the end goals were, and really thought it through, and if they didn't take into account the known unknown and the unknown unknown, right? Then they're not being very scientific, or they suffer from their own blind spots, or they're not being very intellectually honest. So that's the best way I could answer that, and I'm really sorry that I don't know. I think your guess is at least as good as mine.
Well, these are tough questions. But looking back on some things, I think we can speculate that it's not actually about the money.
Right.
Because the people how many people actually call the shots? 100? You know what I mean? It's
Yes.
a very, very small number. And, it's much more common that people are just representatives of some group, like the Knights of Malta, or, power
Right.
blocks of some sort. And we really don't even know who controls the city of London. Overwhelmingly important issues, and we don't know. But then if you look at I don't know if you want to call it a more, like you mentioned, spiritual, if you want to look at it in a kind of a, like, I don't know if you want to say materialistic goal,
Mm-hmm.
right? You find things that are interesting, like I think there was one of the founders, I guess you would say spiritual founders of the EU, Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, in his book on practical idealism in the 1920s, where he said basically we need to replace all the people of Europe with a mixture of, Eurasian and blacks and other things, because they'll be
Right.
more easily controlled by the ruling elite. And, in other words, just from a power politic, control perspective, you look at it and then you get into this weaponization of immigration, right? You're in Serbia and you can see how, refugees, immigration, all this can be used as a total weapon, right? And so you have to wonder. I just find it hard to believe it's about the money. And then you probably know the story of one of the Warburgs testified in front of the U.S. Congress in the 1950s, basically saying there would inevitably be a world government. The only question was whether it would be by conquest or consent, is the
Right,
famous
right.
quote, right?
Right.
And so, anyway, it's just very messy. But getting back to, I guess, the more, things you can see, what else do you see in where you are in southeastern Europe? What do you think is going to happen in Ukraine, for example?
You have in Ukraine a conflict which has claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people. It has displaced at least several million, over a million involuntarily. Another million have fled from the west of Ukraine, either to avoid the draft or for economic issues. And this has created a massive humanitarian crisis. And it seems that at the moment, right, that the Russian government has by and large been successful in keeping the Ukrainian state together, which is a sort of a twist from how one might see the narrative if they viewed it from the other side. But I think that if we look at the wars in Iraq and in Syria and in Libya, that a big part of U.S. strategy is creating destabilization. I think that there was a intellectual or cultural blockage, as a result of Orientalism, which sort of thought that, well, Libya is North Africa and the Middle East is, that crazy pocket of the world, and they've always got crazy stuff there. And if the U.S. is doing that, well, who's to say it wouldn't have happened anyway? Or, in other words, they're not European people per se. And I think that there was a misjudgment on the part of many analysts and historians who think that Europe is not subject to these things. And moreover, Ukraine has historically not been considered part of Europe or European civilization. And I'm not talking about that Europe is a peninsula on the end of Asia, and that some might say that there's a geographic boundary of the Ural Mountains, which cuts down to the eastern part of the Black Sea, and that includes Ukraine and Europe. No. I mean, cultural Europe really basically ends at Poland, and Hungary and Poland are probably the last countries of Europe in any real sense that when people think about the horrors of war and that Europe might be spared that. So no, but now we can see with how the immigration thing is being used in Europe that Europe is definitely a target for destabilization. And then looking at Ukraine, there is a belief among European elites, and it's somewhat chauvinistic or, if you will, racist belief that Slavs don't count as European people and Slavic lives are not as valuable as their own. And then when you add to that, and I hate to repeat myself, but when you add to that even European lives are not that valuable to European or American elites or whoever this global cabal is or is not, clearly Ukraine means nothing and can be destroyed, and they don't have any compunction with that, and that if there is any stabilizing force in Ukraine, it's Russia. So to reiterate or to recap, certainly Russia has succeeded so far in stabilizing the region. It's unpopular to say, but more than anyone else, they have helped to keep the government in one piece, and they haven't yet moved into a stage where they are actively working to try to surgically disassemble Ukraine. But it would certainly, in order for that to happen and to sort of predict the next question about the independence of LPR, of Lugansk and Donetsk republics, this wouldn't leave a manageable existing Ukrainian state unless the Galician parts in the west were also having their own kind of Pravi-sector version of LPR and DPR in the west of the country, and that might create a more manageable, politically neutral Ukraine that had two smaller but connected states in its far west and far east. But that's a hypothetical, but the U.S. is still. And I say the U.S. and we're just talking about foreign policy in language of international relations. We're not talking about all Americans. We don't even mean every part of the American establishment, but these forces from within that are possessing the U.S. and using the U.S. as an avatar for their activities. Certainly, Paul, are not happy with the cooling off of the conflict. They're not happy with Minsk II. As imperfect as it has been in implementation, and instances of fighting that can still continue on and off. By and large, the government of Ukraine has no capacity to mount a major offensive. They lost that already, but that will not prevent the U.S. from continuing to try to push Baltic state countries, Latvia, Lithuania, or Poland into this. This connects to the refugee crisis, and to the extent that the Dublin Agreement will stay in effect, or with Schengen and those provisions, what cost will Poland, Latvia, Lithuania incur in relation to that, and how will that push them to make a different deal with the IMF to purchase arms from NATO, and will they be asked to use those arms against Russia? So again, in general, things are not cooling off. It's just that they've been frustrated on that line of contact in Ukraine. And whenever that happens, as we have seen whenever the U.S., again in scare quotes, gets frustrated in one theater, they double down on the next. So then we're back in Syria.
Yeah. Well, why don't we get to Syria? All the talk says Russia's bringing in jets and helicopters and providing real-time satellite imagery and things like that. What do you see going on in Syria?
That is what's happening. I think one of the critical things that gets left out of the media cycle about this is that most of this were things that were agreed to prior to the conflict, talking about arms, not specialists and not trainers or people who will guard facilities. This is a new development, but most of the weapons deals were prior existing. They, in fact, date back to before the conflict began. But what had happened is that, you see, there's a funny thing, and to kind of back up here, that let's say Putin knows, that Merkel knows, that Hollande knows, and that Obama knows. They all know, right, what's really going on. They all know that, there's no secret between them. There's no confusion that that Turkey and Saudi Arabia work with Germany and France and the U.S. to in different ways, and different levels and in different capacities to back it and do this ISIS and FSA thing. There's no secret there, and there's been many mainstream articles written in the New York Times, LA Times, The Guardian, that have talked about certain angles of this. So this is also not a media secret either. And what that is that they, in fact, know who's involved and who's doing what. And the evidence of that, not just besides what's been published, but in terms of their policy, where that's revealed, is that all of these weapons deals that Russia has had with Syria, they agreed to suspend them for a number of years during the time period that Europe agreed to stop directly supporting. They call it the FSA, but then we know that then things get seized by ISIS and so forth. But when Europe ended that agreement and resumed the ban on direct funding of the terrorists, then Russia then resumed. They get the gears going slowly, and they turn. They make statements and they make warnings, and but they do it. And so now that's what we're seeing. In addition to that, you have, of course, the private contractor companies. So again, similar to in Ukraine, and in a way that's managed, but more directly in Syria, because the international laws that apply are very different. And to sort of back up there, of course, what Russia is doing is a combination of international law in terms of what is written, codified, and they're also applying somewhat of a recognition of English common law or American style law, which is law created by action by past precedent. So they allowed the U.S. to, for example, start to create some precedents about use of proxy forces on foreign territory, and they are mirroring that. But they have been very careful not to exceed what is being done by their opponents, and do things more transparently and through the lens of international law, as opposed to new doctrines which greatly diverge from international law, which is what the U.S. has done since at least probably what we could say concretely since the period of Clinton with Yugoslavia, and of course continuation with Iraq and the way they played games with the UN atomic energy inspectors, Hans Blix, and quoting the wrong people and playing the game and bombing Iraq. That was under Clinton, and all of these were massively against the direction of the body of international law prior to this. And Russia has been very, I think, very steady and very muted in their way that they have tolerated and have responded to that. And now they are using, and of course Syria, the government of Syria, led by the Ba'ath Party, is the only legal entity in Syria. They are the only legitimate government that can make international treaties. And so, unlike with Ukraine, where there was a coup first, and then Russia has had to use more less overt methods to get involved. In Syria, the government has every right to invite Russia. I mean, in Syria, the government could invite the Russian army to come occupy the whole country. They have that right. And there'd be, the Western media would have a cow, and they're trying to, they're trying to make it sound like Russia is making some war against Syria. I mean, it's really very strange headlines that we're seeing lately. But of course, and these are meant to kind of pollute our minds and to create brain fog and make us forget that there is a government in Syria. They are the ones that are saying, please, Russia, come in and help us stabilize things.
Well, I mean, I think that you got to realize the Western, or at least the American propaganda agenda has kind of, I don't know if you want to say gone off the rails, but it's become ridiculous. Right. I mean, it's gone from questionable 20 years ago to absurd. Right. I mean, before really it was Saddam Hussein is bad because he has chemical weapons, and we know that because we sold it to him. Right. We have the receipts. Right. And now it's gone to the point where with ISIS, it's like we created it, controlled it, provide the logistics through, Incirlik base, in Turkey. Right. And, and now, I guess we have to bomb them, and you're supposed to trust us. We're going to, I mean, this is so absurd. Right. You don't really know what to say about this, but it makes me, getting back to this theme that we may be on the verge of major turmoil like World War I, it bothers me kind of deep down inside that I get the feeling that the people at the top in the West don't care about the future in the way they used to. If that makes sense to you. Do you know what I mean?
Of course, in the past, the future was farther away, right? And I think they could afford to care because the technologies that would, of course, it's really required, and this is an area I have some knowledge in, but of course, technologies, and actually, and interestingly, Orwell also talked about this, but there was just a sort of even or evenly distributed increase of technologies in all spheres of the sciences, right? Let's just say, hypothetically, that really this technologies ultimately undermine class systems, mechanisms of control, even the nature of the economy. And if we just look at, say, the economy alone, which we can define as the economy being how you manage the creation of goods and services within the context of scarcity, once you are no longer have scarcity, once the material technical capacity of production in an economy explodes, the concept of economy itself, which is getting as much out of as little as possible. Once you've exploded past that, you're no longer have an economy. You actually just have abundance, and then the mechanisms of distribution are no longer based in scarcity, and then you no longer have middlemen. And it undermines the basis of a class system. Orwell understood this, and that's why in his world of 1984, you have a permanently static technological system, right, where Oceania, Eurasia, and whatever the other one is, are all, stuck technologically at a certain place, and I think had been for 30, 40 years. That kind of reminds me of what's happening right now, and I think we touched on this briefly before, but there used to be so much more of this sort of, you had, Walt Disney and optimism. That's the word. You had the mission to the moon, and you had Walt Disney and Epcot Center, and you had these different inventors and visionaries, and there was the toaster oven and the microwave, and then you go to the bank and open up a new account, and they'd give you one, and you could get a car loan at 1.5%, and wages covered costs, and people had debt, but it wasn't the primary source of their purchasing power, and things moved in a completely different direction, and And I, from my age and I was not raised on this optimism. I was, if someone were to do like a study of what children were exposed to in, youth culture, for us, it was like it wasn't the wonders of atomic energy. It was like nuclear fallout. It was Mad Max, and it was mutants and zombies and stuff like that, horror movies. And for people born like in say in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it's been a message about chaos and anarchy and war. It's not been, we were not raised on a message of hope and the future and the space race and NASA and rocket ships and cures for diseases. It's all been about riding the tiger, and now you have survivalists and you have preppers, and I think that's a real product of the culture and the reality as it exists now. It's very scary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe they conned us before. I found it ironic you said Walt Disney and the space program, and I thought, those kind of go together, don't they? Hollywood and NASA seem to me to have a close relationship.
Very close.
Yeah, very, very close. But we'll leave that for another time. But I have another thought with this, though. I think that, and this is a little bit more upbeat than the typical discussions of World War I repeating. I think that the whatever you want to call them, that global elite, the New World Order crowd, thought they had things under control in, let's say, the 60s or 70s or whatever, the 1950s or something. And I get the feeling the last 20 years or so they've become very frenetic and kind of afraid that they're losing their grip or that they won't achieve what they thought they were going to achieve. And this could be through the rise of technology reaching uncontrolled areas, right? That could be India, it could be Indonesia, I don't know, it could be China or Russia. But, we're talking about, very, very cheap energy sources. We're talking about swarms of very, very small drones. The weapons and energy technologies alone threaten to totally overthrow the current system on Earth.
They absolutely do.
We're not talking like distant future here. We're not talking 50 years from now, because they've been suppressing energy technology for decades, right? That it's possible that could be rolled out in 10 years if they wanted to. If somebody with the ability to not get killed wanted to do it. So I'm just saying, maybe they're getting so crazy with what they're doing in Europe, for example, and the Near East, due to their fear that their game plan isn't working the way they wanted. You mentioned
right.
Ukraine, even with Syria.
Right. There's a possibility that that they lost the script somewhere, that they went off. There's a possibility that that the generation of people making decisions now are misinformed, and that they've misinterpreted the nature or the reasons that decisions were made by the people right before them. There is like a continuation, of course. There's not one day when the old people retire and all the new people come in. So there is a fabric that ties them all together, going back to the beginning of time, really. But there are new ideas that come in, or people who have the power to make new policy in certain areas, and it can be very misinformed. These technologies that are coming and that could be rolled out in a decade if that was so decided. There are few governments in the world that are positioned to be able to maintain, to create the bridge between present modes of social control and future modes of social control, bridging between top-down hierarchical, vertical, and moving towards bottom up or evened out across a plateau, horizontal, peer to peer. I think that these are emerging everywhere. And I do want to connect this back to the war, and I can. And I would say that these technologies and the way that they get developed and the way they get used and how they get shared really shows that among most consumers and most producers and among the genius of most producers, that money is not the primary or even a secondary or even tertiary concern. You look at the peer-to-peer and file sharing and programming revolution and shareware has really exploded the myth that you need to have the specter of being a multimillionaire dangling in front of you in order to want to cure a disease or to create a new program that's going to save tens of millions of labor hours in some industry, right? So, and I think that the media is losing control of that script as well because of, and I'm not a member of the Church of the Internet. It has its limitations. It can also be pulled in some places and very much controlled. But I'm also a realist, and we can see that the Internet has shown us the possibility of a world without getting all teary-eyed and seeing unicorns and rainbows and shit. That actually would not need the very same types of control structures that we have today. So what happens when an economy, and to tie the point in to these wars, you can look at the Pacific Rim, the arming of Japan foreseeably against China, and the rise of ISIS and Al Qaeda in the Turkic parts of China, and their role in the emerging war in Syria, Russia in Ukraine, Russia in Japan, Russia in Cuba, Russia in Syria, and the U.S. and their 800 plus military installations around the world. That a cataclysmic war does what? It destroys infrastructure, and all that infrastructure represents technologies. It represents countless billions of hours of labor hours that have created the foundations for a better economy, for less work to go into producing basic needs and services that we all depend on and that we all need. And that so to set back the hands of time is one of the goals of bombing, of destroying infrastructure. It's not just to weaken the opponent in some static, non-moving way, but it quite in economic terms literally sets back the hands of time to a prior existing period. The less machines you have and the more human hands you have working, the more profitable the venture is. Now you're producing a lower volume of goods, so of course that actually is more profitable because you have as many needs, but you have fewer apples to go around. You have as many hands, but you have fewer apples. So the price of those apples goes up, and the value of the labor in procuring those apples is also more valuable.
Well, I still think we're looking at them trying to, the story, the myth of Sisyphus or Canute, King Canute.
Yes.
That they're trying to do the impossible here by, for the sake of the argument, let's say they blow up a few things in China. Okay.
Right. I think they have.
Yeah, just wild speculation here. No
Right.
basis for this. But let's just say they blew up a few things in China. Okay, but you know the size of China.
Right.
You're talking 1.5 billion people here that are industrious and on a roll. I just, okay, yeah, you can anger them and provoke internal dissension, which I think is a bigger goal. But I don't know. It's just difficult for me to see that. It would require a major war, not a soft coup in Guatemala, not, wiping out Libyan civilization. This is, not that those aren't horrible things, but I'm just saying that in the scheme of things, the population of Libya is very small. It wasn't a big player in any sense. And, you need a major war in Europe or something or China or something to really set back the clock the way you're describing it. Or,
Right.
freeze the clock. And I just don't know. I just don't see that. I think that they're going to have to get more brutal, so to speak. Right now it's all been this I don't know if you want to call it sophisticated, but kind of with plausible deniability, so to speak. And I
Yeah,
don't think
soft
that.
power.
Yeah, but even just like blowing things up, maybe in China.
Yeah,
Right?
terrorism, right?
Terrorism, but
Sabotage.
yeah, but it's still kind of small. I think that to
Yeah,
actually do what you're saying, they they need the fleet. You know what I
right.
mean? They need something bigger, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. But I tell you what, I got a question for you before we wrap it up today. Um, how do you feel now versus, let's say, I don't know, 5 years ago or whenever you moved to Serbia? How have things played out, and are you more upbeat, more pessimistic? How have your feelings changed at all?
I'm I'm not surprised at the way things have gone. We have this because we're programmed in a way to think that what's the word, normalcy, or stability is the norm. And I think that in fact chaos is the norm, and that it takes a lot of effort to keep things normal. I think that stampedes can happen very quickly. I think that riots can happen very easily. I think that there are psychosocial contagions, and they can spread very rapidly. And I think that panic, I think there's a primordial human tendency to press the internal panic button, and everything goes kind of nuts pretty quickly. And I think that in the last 5 years, it's like I want to be surprised, but I'm not. I mean, it's sort of like things that we've talked about, or things that I've read, or things that I have thought or written myself 5 years ago, and you write them and you're fairly confident that things are going to get much worse before they get better. But we're all kind of programmed to think that it'll work itself out. Cooler heads will prevail. They're not going to make World War III, right? But look, they did it twice before, and it's not a secret that the same moral factors are at play, the same economic factors are at play. Of course, the details are different, but it's the same script in a lot of ways, and so to think that we're immune from that is foolish. And I think in the last 5 years that I am more positive that things are going to get worse before they get better.
Okay.
But I'm also more optimistic, actually, that the forces of multipolarity, I think, are much stronger now. I would agree with you, Paul. I think that you're really spot on, that it's going to be really hard for, if we call them this multinational elite from the West, to con the world into making a global war against itself. I think that's very difficult. I think 5 years ago they had a better chance, in fact, if they were able to kick it off. In fact, I think that, as crazy as it sounds, that the neocons are right, that it was the 90s that the U.S. lost the window, and it makes perfect sense that they would have done, whatever it was in 2001, the World Trade Center. It makes perfect sense that they already knew it was too late then. They're like, well, you've got to give it the old college try, and here's how. And I think they were trying to really kickstart or, jumpstart this American empire into high gear. It really, Iraq and Yugoslavia was not enough. The U.S., the cost of housing soldiers in another country, in an occupation, you might bill it as a cost for war, but you would have been housing them anyway. I mean, they're living off of their LM2 statements or whatever. I mean, they receive the same. They might get an extra $200 a month for combat pay or something like ridiculous like that. But it doesn't really cost that much more if you've got a standing army to have them stationed in other countries as part of an occupation. And so, really, to conclude on that point, the neocons were right. As sociopathic as they are about the human cost and their wanton disregard for human life, in strictly geostrategic terms, they are the most correct. It was the 90s that was the time for the American empire to reinstitute the Monroe Doctrine, to take Latin America, but instead they failed, and the Pink Storm happened, and Lula happened, and Chavez happened, and all of that happened, and they failed. They didn't, and they got some discord going in the Middle East, but they didn't push the right way. They were never able to change the global discourse to justify the use of nuclear weapons against countries that don't have them. They should have been able to like nuke countries in the Middle East, and they just couldn't. They did not have the support internally in the command structure of the U.S. military, and they would have never gotten the support from most of the European elites for that either. So they really lost this window.
Yeah, and I think this kind of begs, in a sense, we go back to the same questions over and over again, right? But one of them is, and this would actually get into Russian strategy. Russian strategy for a long time has been to try to become friends with various parts of the European elite, right? I mean, right. You can call that convergence under Andropov, or you can, I don't know what the term would be today with Kremlin strategy for the last 15 years of trying to become friends with Germany. But you know what I mean. And it's rational. I'm not saying it's a bad approach, but it begs the question of what are the splits within European elites, and to what extent do they want this neocon dream, or to what extent do they want a more, I guess I hesitate to say, but a more equal multipolar New World Order?
Right.
Do they want a New World Order that America and the City of London run, or do they want a New World Order where Brazil and China and India and Indonesia get to sit at the table?
It is possible to manage a society where the many of the economic elites do not have a seat at the table with the political elites. I mean, you have the ruling class, but you really, that you have the owning class and you have the ruling class, and sometimes there's not always overlap per se. I mean, there are, for example, and sometimes to have this separate owning class and ruling class can be a strong benefit. You can eliminate the sort of pressures that come with that. And I think that in societies, for example, in times of the USSR that were less corrupt, or say, before the Khrushchev era, before Brezhnev for sure, that there was a clear line between the political power and the social power that came with being an enterprise manager, for example. Or you can take in China, again, there's not perfect, there is corruption, there's nepotism, there's cronyism, but there is a line between political and economic power, and I think this is a benefit. Now, in Europe, there's also a line between economic power and political power, but the problem is that the political power is not sovereign. So while much of the economic power knows that war would be disastrous and knows that they need to increase their ties with Russia and China and to end this embargo against Iran, and if you had the econ guys running things, surprisingly, you wouldn't have this present conflict. The political elite in Brussels are like are to the military what I guess like NATO is, and they're being dominated by the City of London and Wall Street, so the economic elite on continental Europe don't have as much power as their financial ties would otherwise seem to indicate that they ought to in a normal, I guess, capitalist democracy.
Well, Joaquin, I seem to recall years ago from Plato kind of the general idea that, how can I say it? The visible rulers would be like political figures, and if you have any intuition or brains, you realize they don't call the shots, right, in most countries. And then above them can be a business or financial class or something. But the actual rulers are more in the chivalric orders. And so we're talking Knights Templar, Knights of Malta. I mean, even Skull and Bones is a knight, Knights of Eulogia or something.
Mm-hmm,
You know what I
mm-hmm.
Because in
Yes.
other words, they're basically powerful gangs. Do you know what I mean? Like a faction within the CIA or something. They're like powerful gangs that have the ability to blackmail, spy, intimidate, and of course apply violence.
Yeah,
Right?
I think the analogy to gangs is quite apt. And people who are familiar with gangs, it's not just like, oh, we all get together and do violence and deal drugs, but the kernel of powerful gangs in prison gangs, there's a lot of ritual and a lot of belief, and it's like a religion. It's a cult,
Yeah,
and
of course, it's a
all of the
cult.
Right. All of the tattoos have the symbolism, and they have ritual. They have ritual killings. They have initiation killings, and they have ritual killings, and they have orders that are superfluous except for the point of maintaining who gives the orders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ruling elite, look, you just having like money and power, it doesn't enough. It doesn't hold it together. You're going to get too many people with independent thoughts. You're going to get too many side projects. So there is like a cult of the ruling class that the members of the ruling class are kind of like slaves to, in a way. And I'm not feeling sorry for them, but for this thing to have its own life of its own, and it has its own internal inertia, its own bureaucratic life. The institution itself develops its own consciousness, like Hobbes's Leviathan. Excuse me.
Well, exactly. I mean, and you can look at them through history. I mean, even in modern times, like in Germany, with the where they scar their faces with the lash, the whip.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You see all these top Nazis. Skorzeny was one of them. But anyway, they have this nasty scar, and it's an elite aristocratic kind of thing that initiates you into basically what could be called a cult. And
right.
Anyway, that's kind of the way I think the world at a higher level actually works, and it's not really about money, because when you're in those groups, it's like saying with a cult you might know, the Unification Church or something. Is it really about the money for people in there? I mean, I don't know. I think it's
the money is the vehicle.
Right. I mean, a prison gang, that's a thing you're in for life, isn't it? That's not,
right.
You know what I mean? It is not the money. These are serious people, and that's the problem, is that it's not about the money. We could, Russia could make business deals with Germany over the Ukraine, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
If it were really about the money, or the gas deals with Turkey and southeastern Europe or something. But unfortunately, at the top, it looks like it's more about their kind of strange beliefs that come down to power and whatever. But I tell you what, Joaquin, we've had enough of your time today. We know you've got to run, and let's we'll get you back soon for a part 2 where we can go into this really explosive situation around your part of the world.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface. We'll definitely call this part 1, and we will definitely get your listeners back up, and I hope we can just pop this next one out and have it filled with a lot more details, hopefully as soon as next week if we can.
Okay, well, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. So that's it, folks. It's a wrap. Till next time.